I'm Victoria Shirley, and today we are looking into the Georgia midterm elections. And to help me out with that, we're bringing on Tim Darnell. He's a digital content producer with Atlanta News First. And Tim, I've seen a number of your interviews, and you are incredibly well-versed in this topic.
Yeah, thank you, Victoria. It's a pleasure to talk politics here on Local News Live. Georgia has a number of elections in which voters are casting their ballots now. We have one of the most nationally watched gubernatorial races in the nation, with Republican incumbent Brian Kemp seeking a second and final term as governor of our state, facing a challenge from Democrat Stacey Abrams, who is seeking once again to become the nation's first African-American female governor. She came close in 2018 when she and Brian Kemp were campaigning for an open seat in the governor's mansion. She came close by about 55,000 votes or so, and now is making another attempt. It was almost really preordained and was not a surprise to see her once again launch another gubernatorial campaign, and we'll know very, very soon whether or not she has been successful in that regard.
All right, so a number of hot races happening in Georgia. What would you say are the ones, especially for people outside of Georgia, what would you say are the ones to keep a close eye on?
The ones to keep a close eye on as in the coming hours is really Georgia's governor's race, but for a national focus and for a more nationally significant State Senate race. We have Reverend Raphael Warnock, a Democrat who was elected only 2 years ago in a special election that really surprised a lot of the nation's political establishment. For the first time in decades, Georgia has elected 2 Democratic U.S. senators, and Raphael Warnock, you know, by all accounts, really ought to be fairly well ahead in his reelection bid, but he's being challenged by Republican Herschel Walker, who has gained national attention for a number of allegations that has come his way. Herschel Walker has a very strong emotional connection with a number of Georgia voters, particularly those in the sweet spot of, say, 45 and over, 55 and over, from his days as a University of Georgia football legend. By all accounts, in my opinion, Raphael Warnock should really be ahead by 10 points or so, but every poll, every survey that we've seen show a true virtual tie between a sitting incumbent senator and a political novice who has never run for political or for office before, seeking to oust him after only 2 years. So this is arguably the most important national race that Georgia has going right now.
And I keep seeing headlines that say Georgia is at the center of the political universe for the midterms this year. Why do you think that is?
Georgia was at the center of the political universe 4 years ago when Stacey Abrams came very close to upsetting or to gaining the governor's mansion when she and Brian Kemp were running the first time around. 2 years later, in 2020, the state was at the center of the national political firestorm. If you recall, that Georgia became the only deep South state to vote Democratic for Joe Biden. Arguably, Joe Biden perhaps wouldn't be sitting in the Oval Office right now if Georgia had tipped to or remained solidly in the Republican column. So Georgia has taken on a national political focus simply because of the fact that Stacey Abrams and the Democratic Party, Raphael Warnock and our other sitting U.S. Senator, Jon Ossoff, have done a masterful job in terms of organizing the Democratic vote, registering record numbers of voters. When early voting began a few weeks ago, within a week, Georgia had already cast more than 1 million early votes in just under a week and a half. These numbers are unheard of. So not only has Georgia gained a lot of national attention, it's got a lot of people, a lot of voters inside our state's boundaries who are very, very interested and invested in these races.
All right, so Georgia is a battleground state this November for the midterm elections this year. Is that something unusual, or is it something that's happened before during other election cycles?
Georgia became a battleground state for the Republican Party in the early 2000s when our state legislature, both the House and the Senate, and the governor's mansion were won by the Republican Party. This came after well over 100 years of political domination from the Democratic Party. So we began seeing Georgia really become a battleground state, truly competitive in the early 2000s. Since the mid-2000s, the state has been dominated politically by the Republican Party. No Democrat has held a statewide constitutionally elected office since really the late 2000s. And it's only been within the past 4 years, with Stacey Abrams' masterful gubernatorial campaign and her unmatched fundraising skills, that began to become evident in 2018 that Georgia's become more of a competitive state, having been dominated for really the previous 15 years by the Republican Party. Now, at the congressional level, we are still not really a competitive state. At the state legislative level, I fully expect Republicans to continue to hold majorities in the state House and the state Senate and many of the constitutionally elected offices. The Democratic Party really needs a strong showing from Stacey Abrams to bring other Democratic candidates for office across the finish line.
All right, and so if you're just now joining us, let me just do a brief reset. We're speaking with Tim Darnell. He's with Atlanta News First out of our station in Atlanta, Georgia. He is the digital content producer and very incredibly well-versed in politics within the state of Georgia. Have you noticed, I'm sure through the years, you've noticed patterns as Georgia voters head to the polls. Is there anything unique? Is there anything different about this election cycle?
The major thing that's different really about this election cycle is how much the Democratic Party is really pinning its hopes on a voting demographic that historically has not shown a great deal of participation in the electoral process. Stacey Abrams came within 55,000 votes 4 years ago of becoming the state's first Democratic governor of the 21st century, and also becoming the first African-American female governor in American history. She and the other members of the Democratic Party, those other Democratic candidates, are really pinning their hopes on the younger demographic of voters that President Biden himself has made an issue of really reaching out to, with the most recent example of student debt relief and of climate change. These are issues that poll very high among a more diverse, younger voting demographic. So it's really going to be interesting to see what turnout is going to be on Election Day within just a few hours and going on right now.
And what would you say through your coverage, your reporting, are the top ticket items that most of these candidates are campaigning on? And on the flip side, what do you think voters are looking for when it comes to those top ticket, hotly discussed issues?
Earlier this year, when the U.S. Supreme Court issued or basically overturned Roe versus Wade, which had been the nation's abortion regulations for the better part of the last 50 years, it virtually guaranteed that abortion and a woman's right to choose would become a major political issue this November. Stacey Abrams, Raphael Warnock, the entire Democratic slate of candidates are making these issues. Also, the issue of gun safety and gun control, a woman's right to choose, abortion. These social issues are at the front and center of every Democratic candidate running for office this year. But polls nationwide and also here in Georgia reflect kind of an interesting dichotomy, because many of the polls that we're seeing are saying that economic issues, gas prices, food prices, inflation, rising cost of living, rising taxes are really at the front and center of many voters' attention. Historically, voters will cast ballots based on how their wallets and pocketbooks are feeling. So the Republicans, very naturally and quite intelligently, are focusing on those economic issues. Governor Kemp here in Georgia has made it a centerpiece of his campaign that Georgia remains one of the top states in the nation for business, and rejected a lot of the COVID-19 policy recommendations that Stacey Abrams and President Biden and Democrats in Congress were advocating over the past 3 to 4 years during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we see economic issues at the top of voters' priorities, but Democrats are hoping that there is enough of an outrage or interest in social issues such as abortion that will propel them to victory on Election Day.
All right, let's turn our attention to former President Donald Trump. He has exerted his influence, or he has attempted to exert his influence in a number of races across our country. Has he done the same in Georgia? Who has he endorsed there, and is it moving the needle in terms of polling?
In terms of it moving the needle in polling, perhaps, but here's the issue to keep in mind. Former President Trump recruited a former United States Senator here in Georgia named David Perdue to challenge Governor Kemp in the May 24th primaries held earlier this year. Former President Trump also has recruited and endorsed Herschel Walker in his bid to become Georgia's next U.S. Senator. Former President Trump also endorsed State Senator Burt Jones in his effort to become Georgia's next lieutenant governor. The current incumbent here in Georgia in the lieutenant governor's office, Jeff Duncan, was a very vocal critic of former President Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election results here in Georgia that just became a national center of political controversy and really a political firestorm. President Trump also recruited a United States congressman named Jody Hice to challenge Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, who gained national attention just a few months ago when he testified before the Democratic-led January 6th Commission on the Capitol riot that was held back in 2021, that occurred in 2021. Herschel Walker, of all those candidates, and Burt Jones are the only two who are still standing in this year's election. Governor Kemp absolutely handed a solid defeat to David Perdue earlier this year, really refuting the former president's efforts to become involved in the Georgia elections this year. Brad Raffensperger also handily won a very crowded May 24th Georgia Secretary of State Republican primary. So two of the most prominent figures who were really front and center during the 2020 presidential election result controversy, Governor Kemp, Secretary of State Raffensperger, they're still on the ballot and they're still polling very, very high. So it's debatable how much influence the former president has here in the state.
Very interesting, especially to see what will shake out on election night. Is there anything else, any other key points of interest, things that people from a national perspective should know about what's happening this election season in the state of Georgia?
Arguably, the fate of the United States Senate in terms of who will hold the balance of power in the world's oldest legislative or deliberative body really is going to hinge, I believe, on who wins Georgia's U.S. Senate race, with both of the candidates, Raphael Warnock, the incumbent, Herschel Walker, the challenger, virtually tied. Neither of them even close, really, to the 50+1% margin of victory. We could be looking very likely, or very real possibility, at a runoff in another month, sometime later in November. It was interesting, Herschel Walker released a campaign ad several weeks ago really urging his supporters to go out and recruit volunteers or votes, because otherwise we'll be deciding the balance of power in Washington, D.C. over the Thanksgiving holidays, and no one really wants that. So it's all going to become to hinge on turnout, but I think we're looking at a very real possibility of having another month to go or to decide which party, Republicans or Democrats, will hold the very slimmest of majorities in the U.S. Senate.
All right, again, joining us here on Local News Live is Tim Darnell. He is a digital content producer for Atlanta, or at our Atlanta station at Atlanta News First. Thank you so much for joining us here on Local News Live and giving us that very insightful information about the election for the midterms this year.
Thank you, Victoria.